But I just, I want to see how do we say to a person, hey there, kid who's not a white bearded guy, you're in science. How do we say to you, you can also do science with beer? Because it's almost like there's certain groups of people who don't know that they can get into that and they can get into that world. Like, what is it that, like, do you think that we do to encourage these future generations? I remember coming here when I was in high school and being like, oh, one day I'll never be on that stage. Today is that day that I never thought would happen. So yeah, I'm Ren Navarro and I run Beer Diversity. And I travel around talking about beer and the need for diversity. So my friends here and I want to really just have a safe and open dialogue about diversity. So quite often people think that if you're going to talk about diversity, it's about getting rid of a certain group of people to allowing another group of people. That's not what this is. Bearded white guys in beer, A-okay. Don't go anywhere. But what I want to do and what we want to do is talk about that need to have more room at the craft beer family table. So it's really about saying, shove over, I want to sit there too and I want to enjoy this beer. So my first question is, what does diversity mean to you? And I know Jorge said that a two-parter question is actually two questions. Well, I'm going to ask a second question. How does it look?
Yeah. Okay, cool. To me, diversity is the first part of two things. I've always felt that diversity was bringing people from different backgrounds, different viewpoints and different life experiences in. And I believe that the second factor of that is inclusion, which is providing a safe and welcoming environment in which they can thrive. So that's what it's always been like for me, anyways.
Yeah, I always connect the word diversity with the word opportunity. For you individually, it's an opportunity to learn, it's an opportunity to grow, it's an opportunity to challenge yourself, to step outside of your comfort zone. For me personally, that's always an exciting thing. Meeting someone who has had different experiences than I are really connected to learning.
It's such an amazing chance for human growth.
Oh, for sure.
As well.
Yeah. And what diversity looks like, it's I think you put it so well in saying that you want to grow the people at the craft beer table. You want to grow the number of people at the craft beer table. I think that's absolutely the start. I think that's what diversity looks like, is this opportunity to grow the people at the table, but not only grow the number of people at the table, but to actually grow what's being served at that table too, potentially as well. And that comes from that learning and comes from that growth and comes from that experience of stepping outside of your comfort zone a little bit.
Yeah, and I think with what does diversity mean to me, it's not about it being black or white. Like, there's so much more to it. LGBTQ communities, differently abled people, the indigenous communities, like, it can't just be one simple thing. And a lot of people also think that when we talk about diversity, they go, well, we try to get more people of color. And it's like, well, yes, but what about people who are 45 and up that you don't normally have in your brewery, right? So I think it's one of those, it looks complicated.
Yeah, and we're not just talking about adding more people who may just look like us either.
Yeah, totally.
As well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Simple.
Yeah.
Very simple, very simple. So you just did some traveling. So my question is, when you're traveling in Canada and the States, how's the diversity of the craft breweries that you've seen differ? Or is it better in one spot than in the other? Are there spots that are kind of failing?
Yeah, we've spent quite a bit of time in the U.S. recently, and most of the time there are generally in larger metropolitan areas. We were in Washington, D.C. a couple months ago for a festival, Nashville this past weekend, Phoenix in Austin in January, and the U.S. is always an interesting picture because it's a very similar market in a lot of ways, but there's, huge cultural and, historical roots that, are very different than in Canada. And I think in some places I've seen this, advancement of diversity. I think a lot of that is in larger centers. When I look at New York and when I look at Chicago, strictly from a people of color standpoint, I know several Mexican brewers in Chicago. I know several black brewers in New York. Those people are there. They've been in those cities a lot longer, and they've worked hard to get into those industries for sure. But they found a way, and maybe it's because it's more of a part of normal everyday life there. And the same thing with Phoenix and Austin. I met Hispanic brewers in both of those places as well. But there's still the challenge. I think from the perspective of women entering the market, I think the U.S. I've seen so much of the bro culture persevere there, and that idea of misogyny being okay on craft beer labels, it's somehow so entrenched still. Even though there are more people calling it out, and even there are more people trying to change that culture, there's still a very pervasive thread of some kind of really wrong things going on, especially in the States.
Well, and I think just to jump in about the labels, a lot of places when they do these, I call them lazy labels, right? Because it's it's a boob joke, or it's a woman in a really weird pose. Like there was a brewery in the States that I think is long gone now, called Clown Shoes. And they had an image, and it was a brown lager type thing, and of course it was a brown woman on the label, and she was in a twerking position with wings. And I don't know about my fellow black people, but when I go home, that's how I relax, by twerking with my favorite angel wings on. But and when they got called out, one of the owners was like, "Well, my wife is black," and it's like, yeah, I'm sure she was cool with it.
Well, and that's something we see with a lot of the sexism in beer as well. I mean, actually, I think it was similar with Clown Shoes. I think it was like Tramp Stamp IPA.
But they also did one with a dude on it, so it was different.
They also did one with a dude on it, and I have seen labels like Hop Slut or like filled with like rape jokes, a lot of racist jokes as well, and it always goes back to like, well, of course it was a joke, and we let our one employee who is female, or black, or whatever, know about it, and they thought it was funny. So this is
because
awesome.
Making one person the mouthpiece for an entire group of people always works really well.
Similar to what happened in today's Michael Cohen hearing, if we saw that, where it's just like, of course Trump's not racist. See, there's the one black friend that he has, and yeah, it's that's not how it works.
Yeah, I mean, I was in Nova Scotia last year and kind of traveling around seeing those breweries, and a lot of them were very quiet about things. I think the problem, quote unquote, the problem that we see is that when a brewery does something good, they say, "See, we did this thing," and it's like, no, just do it, right? Like I went to Good Robot.
Well, and that's it. The performative allyship can be really frustrating. I mean, like every June, when Pride comes around, suddenly.
We gays only drink beer for a month.
Yeah, that's apparently all we do, and and breweries that otherwise would not do anything for LGBTQ plus initiatives suddenly are just like, oh yeah, no, rainbow flag. See, we're great.
International Women's Day. You there, one woman who works in the back. Come, I want to take your photo.
Come. Yeah, brew a beer. Let's take a photo. I don't even know
remember
your
name.
Yeah, and notably still silent on Black History Month, but
black people don't drink beer.
They don't. No, it's just it's just the stereotypical stuff, right?
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because when breweries do it properly, and they do jump on the proverbial bandwagon for Pride, you always can tell when that brewery cares, because if they didn't find a group of people to come in and brew it with them, they say, we're going to donate X amount of money, we're going to do these things where at least we educate our staff and we try to make a change in the community.
Yeah.
Well, it's more company culture driven than self-serving, than hey, we did this thing, look, a couple Instagram posts, please like it, and please, think of us highly the next time you pick up a beer. when you're truly engaging in those communities and not posting about it, when you're not speaking about it except for maybe internally and talking about these things as part of your company culture. I think that's when it has the most impact, and that's when it shows that you care the most.
Well, and actually on that example, I hate to put you on the spot, Tej, but I mean, like, I know that you don't put up the billboards for your monthly commitment.
Right.
Want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. Yeah. We're really proud of the work that the YWCA does in Hamilton. It's a really important organization, obviously, globally, but specifically they're a few blocks away from where Merit is, and they serve a population of women that really need a lot of help. And so we take a few of the skills and the talents and the passions that we have in making food and in serving food and engaging in our community. And every month we head down to the YWCA to cook a few meals and to make sure that these women feel appreciated, that they feel special, that they are not just going to a soup kitchen. That this is a proper sit down served meal. It feels like a restaurant experience, and that's uplifting. That's special. That's something that was actually completely initiated by our staff as well, which is what we try to facilitate a lot of internally as well. It's what are you passionate about? What are you excited about? Mm-hmm. How can we support that? Yeah. Whether it's making sure you have the time off or the resources, or us gladly donating the product to be able to do those things. That's just something that we want to do because our staff are passionate about it.
And I think that's a really good example of like how things should be done, because I mean, like, every 2 weeks you're not suddenly bringing the owners of the shelter in and taking a selfie and posting that on Instagram
stories all the way through.
Instagram stories all throughout, and you're just starting. You started it with a seed of just this really good intention and wanting to help, and you're just doing that, And I've always wanted to say this, but I really appreciate you for that.
I don't need an applause.
I
don't need an applause. I'll send that back to the folks that are there every time, though. Thank you.
So I guess part two to that original question, really, and we've kind of touched on it, but about, do you see a conscious effort by certain breweries to get that inclusion? Like, I know, Merit, you're obviously talking to your staff, but there are breweries who do things, and sometimes you kind of have this moment where it's like, well, why did you think of that? And they don't always push forward and say, we wanted to build a sense of community. Because that's the other part about this whole diversity thing, is that when you do something, you are doing it to create more of a sense of community. So there's certain breweries that you think of that you go in and you're like, wow, there's a lot of babies here. But that's what they've created, and that's kind of their niche that has either fallen onto their laps. I mean, you guys have babies on Saturdays. I just pulled a face when I said babies, I'm sorry. I was like, oh, you guys have babies. But you've created this welcoming, like, so that is that piece of inclusion where it's a welcoming space and it's a safe space, right? Like, you go to your favorite brewery because you feel safe and you feel welcome. And if you're going to your favorite brewery and you don't feel those things, maybe you should not make it your favorite brewery. But are there other places that are, I guess, kind of doing it right?
I mean,
that was a really long pause.
That pause doesn't mean that no one is.
Yeah, that pause doesn't mean that we're struggling to think about it. But I mean, the short answer is yes. I mean, and we're going to name some examples. But I mean, yes. But I think it also goes back to what Tej was saying when he was asked about, is diversity different in America? And I believe, for me, it's very much still a clump situation. I've seen some do it fantastically, and most of those in the cities, but also way far out. I'll always love Sleeping Giant Brewing in Thunder Bay. They consistently have charitable events there. They're working with the indigenous communities there. I absolutely love that. But then there are also just other places that just fight against it, and it is that mentality. And whether they actually know that they're fighting against it or not, they're still doing that.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're drinking Resistance Lager, that, that's Muddy York, and they've made a commitment that for every can that they sell, they're going to donate a portion to a bunch of different groups. So there's Black Lives Matter, new Syrian refugees to Canada.
Yeah,
there's LGBTQ Youth Line.
Yeah.
There's an indigenous group, and then there's someone else, and all of that comes out of that beer. And they did it in a way that they originally were going to do it for a short period of time, and then realize like, no, this is actually a thing that we just want to do, and they do it all the time.
And it's available at the bar, folks. It's the red one.
At the bar.
I'll point to a really great U.S. example. There's a brewery in Oakland called Temescal that is in a really predominantly LGBTQ community, and they're so consistent with their efforts to reach that community, to support it, to always cater in terms of the styles of events that they want to do or whatever, and it isn't always just with giant rainbows flags in the background either. It's just it's just serving that community very, very passionately and very consistently. I've just through social media have seen kind of the consistency, and heard through other breweries in California how they're kind of really changing how people reach that community, very specifically in Northern California.
Totally, and also like I even remember, I think it was a few years ago, for the Boston St. Patrick's Day Parade, they were refusing applications for LGBTQ, people who wanted to march, and I believe it was Boston Beer, Sam Adams, pulled out of the festival, and they were their biggest sponsors, and that just spoke volumes. And I mean, also from a business perspective too, won them a bunch of customers, but.
For sure, and I mean, it's, we also think about as customers and consumers, if there's a thing that you don't like and it rubs you the wrong way, you vote with your dollars. You don't have to go in and say, I have a problem with what you do. You can just say, I'm not buying it, right? And when that happens, I don't know if you guys are reading about Founders right now, perhaps. For those of you who don't know, Founders is in the States. They make some really great beer, but screw those guys. Yep. They have a huge race problem. So there is a staff member who basically has been harassed and derogatory comments, and when he went to HR, they were kind of like, yeah, well, the good old boys, like, what's the problem? And a bunch of other things came out, and they tried to fire him, and on and on and on. And this happened 8 months ago, I think it came out. And a lot of people said, I'm not going to buy Founders anymore. And if you go into a lot of LCBOs, Founders still has a lot of shelf space, and nothing is missing from it. So I think that it's slowly getting to the point, hopefully, at least in my LCBO, where it's just people are saying, you know what, I'm not comfortable with it.
Yeah, and also like another bit of just sort of like of the many things that are being added onto that as well. It's also alleged that out of the 200 staff members at that brewery, only 7 were actually black people. And someone tried to point out, I think, because it's Grand Rapids, Michigan. Yeah. And people just say, oh, I've visited there, it's very white. And then I actually pulled up the demographic numbers, and it's actually got the same percentage of black people as Detroit. So
there are no black people there?
Yeah, absolutely none whatsoever.
But I mean, it's, and so we get really mad about these things, and because it's social media, we see it for a minute, we get angry, and then we move on. But the other piece of it is Founders got called out by Beer Culture, which is a black organization in the States, also working to get more diversity in beer and specifically to get black people very interested in beer. And so they wrote a very large article about how we need to still be angry about Founders. And Founders came back and said, well, we've been talking to people and we're trying to learn and we're really sorry for what we did.
We got a sensitivity trainer in to...
Great. Starbucks did it too.
Yeah.
Well, they got kind of almost forgotten about after a couple other incidents, unfortunately, because it's happening more than just every once a year. Mm-hmm. And it was, I think that was an interesting one because it was also one of the first times where a brewery that actually makes really great beer, had a problem like this, so people were like, oh, I really like KBS though.
Yeah, and I think but that's that interesting part, right? Where you have
it's easy to dump a brewery, and you're like, oh, fuck, I don't really.
But you have this weird guilt where you're like, but I really like that beer, and I kind of don't want to stop drinking it.
Well, and actually, that's something.
Just shoplift it. It's fine. Just steal it.
Amazing.
Keep drinking it, but make sure you stole it.
And punch the cops. Why not? But I mean,
I do not condone that part.
Robin maybe does, apparently.
But
yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That is true.
But yeah, I mean, I think that when a brewery or a large organization gets called out, you can't be like, oh, well, we got sensitivity training.
Yeah, and actually, before you sort of like made those funny jokes.
Sorry, I'm distracting.
No, it was great, and it was actually a very black joke about, sorry, pun not intended, about getting shot. But but no, that's actually something that I went through when I heard this news. Because, I mean, every time I went to the States, what would always be like, it turned into a tradition for me, was I would pick up a sixer of all-day IPA, because, like, it's such a good beer.
Yeah.
But then I heard the news, and I'm like, well, I guess I'm not picking up all-day IPA anymore. Because, like, as much as I like that beer, and as much as I like the thing that, the beers that brewery is making, we're at a situation in craft beer right now where things are so fantastic and there's so many options out there that there's a brewery that is probably brewing, that is brewing, good if not better quality beers that don't have that big cloud over their head.
We're only kind of racist. Yeah, and I mean, it's, and yeah, it's been a few weeks of really big missteps of things. Women are kind of getting crapped on with Great Lakes newspaper.
Yeah. Care
to speak about that?
All right. So for those just tuning in at home, a couple of weeks ago there was a newspaper, I believe it's based out of Buffalo, called the Great Lakes Brewing News, and
not connected to Great Lakes.
Not
Brewing
connected
in
to
Toronto, or in Etobicoke.
Yeah, not connected to any of the breweries. It's just Great Lakes Brewing News, and it's a community newspaper about the beer scene in the local, Great Lakes areas. And actually, there unfortunately, you'll find out, but there was actually a really great article about Muddy York on the front page. But sharing the front page with Muddy York was a piece on cask beer in Scotland, which that sounds fine. And it started, the very first sentence was, like all men, I struggle with my primal self.
It's an article about cask beer.
And it went downhill from there. The first paragraph talked about how the Me Too movement has rendered men like him in a feminazi re-education camp, preventing him from being, the big romance guy that he is. And and this wasn't just like a one-page thing. This was like a 2,700 word piece that went into great lengths to talk about, how much he likes to bone down. So, sorry, it's still amazing. But, so I mean, I do this thing where when I hear an idiot say something idiotic, it's stuck in my head, and if I have no one to talk about it with, I just freak out. So I wrote about it on my site, thethirstywench.com.
Bookmark it.
And actually broke it down sentence by sentence on why this was a bad idea. And it was fun, and it resonated with a lot of people. It blew up. The writer of that piece, who is also the publisher of the newspaper, gave several different apologies. The first one was the standard "I'm sorry, you're offended," and the second one was just more of like, "Oh no, it's satire."
Because
and
was it Voltaire that he was blaming?
Oh he started the piece. He started his apology just saying, "Well, I just got finished reading Voltaire, and it's satire."
Because he makes me write stuff like that too.
Yeah, and everyone actually took that apology and they just said, "Oh, it's satire." And I think that they were really expecting it to be like, "Oh, well, if it's satire, that's totally fine. Keep doing your nonsense thing." And it was supposed to be satire, I guess, about that type of person. But everyone just kept on saying how bad satire it was, because there was absolutely no context that it was satire, no context that it was fiction, and it just continued to not do great. But anyways, so while all that was going on, I got a bunch of fun comments from men. Supposedly anonymous, they're men. One, which was, I think, about 800 words long, and it started out with, "If you are offended, don't don't say anything about it, click away. And then he went into 800 words about how he was offended by what I said. And he kept going. There were other comments as well. And the thing is, I'll finish this story in a bit, but yeah, I know I'm taking time, but we're laughing at this, and we're just some goof, some just sort of like dude online. But one comment he said that ended up sticking with me. I deleted it, but I mean, it just stuck with me. I'm not going to say everything that he said, but essentially, there's going to be a bit of swear words here, but men are the dominant gender, and the only reason they allow women to run their fucking mouths is because they have respect, and I'm actually not going to repeat this, but they want to get in your pants, essentially. Shut the fuck up. And we can't laugh at that. And what made me really not laugh at that is that he actually used his personal email address to make that comment, which means that he didn't care if I found out who he was. And I found out who he was. He's a dude in Illinois. He's a roofer, and he's a guy that he's just a regular guy that you would pass on the street. And that's what scares me right now, is that we're entering this age where there's overt racism, there's overt sexism, there's overt homophobia, and back then, it feels like a lifetime ago where you would actually call someone a racist and they'd actually take that as an insult. And they'd like try to backpedal and talk about how much they're not a racist or a sexist or homophobic. And now they're owning it. Now they're actually saying, yeah, that's who I am. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess,
Sorry to kill the mood there, but...
But I mean, these things happen, right? Like,
yeah.
And it's the problem that we're seeing is that we're trying to do this. I mean, I'm talking about diversity in beer. Like, beer's not saving anyone. We're not really changing the world, but it's a really great product that most of us love. And I agree. People are really starting to get out there, and if they don't like what you say, they're bang on with their faces in these pictures. And I realize that I'm doing the right thing because I now have my own set of trolls. Look, Ma, I made it. Someone hates me. But yeah, I mean, I had a guy recently tell me that there were no barriers to access in craft beer and I needed to stop whining and why don't I just open my own brewery? Because I have like so much money burning a hole in my pocket right now. But I also found out who he was, and it turned out he owns a restaurant that I used to be his craft beer sales rep at for 2 years. Thanks, buddy. I hope your beer goes bad. But it's this same thing, right, where we talk about just including people and not making these massive changes. I'm not asking for us to stomp on the brakes and white guys with beards get out of the car. That's not what it is. And so the fact that these people are losing their minds about beer, where you say, I just want to feel safe. I want someone to say, I see you, I hear you, come have a seat. Come in and chat with me. Tell me about what beer you're drinking. And I don't understand how a group of people can be like, no, that's not okay.
Well, and I think one of the things, too, with like all this intolerance and hate as well, I mean, like, one, it's not going to change overnight, obviously. But we're talking about it in terms of the beer industry and as consumers for beer and all that stuff. Like, this is a bigger societal change that needs to happen. But because we work in the beer industry and we're actually seeing where we can actually change it. That's what we're trying to do. And that's something that, like all facets of society, I feel need to be inside out. So, start within the industry and build up there.
And you really, you have to. It's, clean up your own house before you go running to your neighbors.
Totally.
And, and not to get so down, but I mean, we're starting to see breweries get it right, and we're starting to see consumers ask more questions, right? Like, looking out here, we've got a really great group of people out here. Like, thanks for showing up. But you guys are here because you're interested in hearing about what you're enjoying right now. And you want a brewery, I mean, like the beer we're pouring tonight, we've selected them for a really specific reason. I mean, it just happens to be that Tej is Merit, but Merit makes great beer. And, the beer that's from Merit I helped make. But Muddy York does things, Merit does things, Red Circle does things. Like Red Circle's probably the newest on the block of those offerings, and I picked them because they're my friends and they're in Kitchener. But they're also doing really great things to help the community, and they're building senses of community, and that's what these breweries are doing. If you have never been there before and you walk in, they make you feel welcome, and that's really what it's all about. You go for a walk and you find a new store and you go in and someone's like, hey, welcome. That's what it should be in beer. It should never be, how did you find this? How'd you get here? Right?
Or just like, maybe don't make your representative, or your mascot essentially. Yeah, doing the Porky Pig. But yeah, your mascot essentially, straight, white, cis, bearded dude.
Yeah, and I think
and that's just even a simple thing like that. There's so many of them that.
I think we are seeing a change in that.
I agree.
There are still some very kind of like, I'll just use the term old guard kind of like rooted, or like old train of thought rooted breweries that even new ones, people that are opening up with that. But I think I'm really encouraged by a lot of the new breweries that are coming out with a focus on community, with wanting to be proactive in trying to reach more people. And maybe it's just a matter of time. I don't want to wait 40 years to see it be
Totally.
be completely different.
I remember back in the day. But yeah, no, and I think that those are things that are starting to change. I mean, there's certain sectors, like, so I was a sales rep for 5 years before I started doing this, and I was the only black queer female sales rep in Ontario. And when I left in April, that was it. Like, I was the last of the unicorns. And, but there are more people of color, and there's more LGBTQ, so it's slowly changing. I would love to see a black female sales rep. I don't know why we're all scared, and I don't want to go back to it, but it was great. But kegs are heavy. But I just, I want to see, how do we say to a person, hey there, kid who's not a white bearded guy, you're in science. How do we say to you, you can also do science with beer? Because it's almost like there's certain groups of people who don't know that they can get into that, and they can get into that world. Like, what is it that, like, do you think that we do to encourage these future generations?
I think the conversation about encouraging more consumers and encouraging more people looking at careers in the industry are kind of rooted in a lot of the same walls, and it starts with just this simple perception, and again, I think it's starting to change. I think it needs to happen on every level, from home brewing clubs to where craft beer bars are located, to events like this happening more and more, thanks to Ren continuing this conversation over and over and over again, and it's not going to stop, which is great.
Yeah.
I also think that, like, an aspect of things too is that craft beer and craft breweries still have this reputation of there being gold up in their hills. That's like a good way to make money, which, ladies and gentlemen, it is not. But just this thought, I mean, that start a craft brewery, and we're seeing more and more and more of these. And I mean, people from all walks of life, as cynical as it sounds, but want to make money.
Oh, for sure. And
I think that's an aspect too, and they're just taking a look at where, in some communities where this is particularly growing, and they're being a part of it.
Yeah, I mean, you were saying about homebrewers. I had a homebrewer association basically be like, hey, can we talk about this? We don't have a lot of women showing up to our meetings, and they're signing up, but they're not coming out to meetings. And I said, well, where do you hold your meetings? And they were like, oh, at members' basements. I was like, there's your first problem. I'm a woman going by myself to a rando's basement. What's the worst that could happen?
To get drunk.
And so they so we had this conversation, and I was like, guys, and they started pairing with breweries, and lo and behold, a bunch of women showed up, because breweries are safe spaces.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think that sometimes it takes thinking about the simple barriers like that, where it's happening.
Totally.
It doesn't always have to be so deep and complex, and this whole philosophical issue. It's simplicity sometimes as well.
No one wants a creepy
basement
meeting.
No, I don't want to go there either.